Terrific. Thanks very much, Harlan and Marc. We have a few questions from the audience, but I think I'm going to start us off with a question about the relationship between research and creatives. Maybe, Marc, you can start us off with that. What within the paradigm that you've talked about, how do you think researchers and creatives would work together?
Well, I think that's a very, very good question. Unfortunately, it'll take a long time to answer it. Research and creatives often have a bit of a tumultuous relationship with each other. And when we look at research and the creative thinking processes, it really depends upon what type of research, who is using it and what their expertise are, and where it comes in terms of the creative thinking process itself. So it's not an easy question to answer. We know that if you provide too much information early on during the creative ideation process, so when people are initially generating ideas, that can cause what we refer to as mental set fixation. We get locked in to a certain way of thinking. It can limit our creative thinking. So that can result in sort of more incremental, low risk type research. This is I hate to say it, sort of the Procter & Gamble type model, where they do a whole lot of, spend vast amounts of money on consumer research, and they do a whole lot of really good incremental stuff really, really quickly. And that's a relatively low risk creative strategy, because if you move fast enough, but small steps, everybody can follow those steps. You're not making those huge leaps. And so you don't really have these evaluation problems. However, in advertising, we often, the new brands trying to get some sort of position in the market, trying to break through all that clutter, they want much more divergent thinking to take place. So again, too much research early on can be problematic. However, what we're seeing with the creatives is they've got really good divergent thinking abilities. In other words, their associative abilities, their ability to think outside the box is fantastic. So they're providing a whole lot of research early on, doesn't really limit their ability to think creatively, and actually drives a bit more appropriateness. So you get not too much of a bad trade-off, which we normally get in relation to too much non-producing originality. But the problem with, of course, the client coming in and having too many requirements and too much research, it can signal to those creatives that they're not going to accept their highly divergent ideas. So it's probably more of a signaling issue. So, I mean, there's a whole lot of issues here, and I don't want to, there's also I don't want to talk for too long, an issue in regards to how we're using that data as well. And Hugh's got some good data on that space, because sometimes things like copy testing, data which comes in after the event, if creatives have that, it actually counterintuitively increased originality, because it gave them the freedom to actually be highly divergent and then sort of game it at the end, put those elements in there. So, sorry, it's a long way to answer the question, probably only touched upon some of the issues, but like everything, it's complicated.
Thanks very much. First of all, I want to introduce Scott McDonald, who's joined us for the Q&A session. The reason why, Marc, I asked the question is, I know a number of the people who are listening to this are from our Creative Council, and they produced a research report back a few months ago about the relationship between creatives and research. And the paradigm that you presented was I just couldn't understand sort of how research worked its way in. And I'm interested for any of the other speakers, if they have any experience in either how creatives work with researchers, any successful models out there. Are there any examples of models that have been less successful? And it looks like, Scott, you've raised your hand.
But it wasn't to respond to that question. I was just saying hello, since I was.
Oh, no, the other Scott.
Yeah, oh, okay.
Well, maybe two Scots raised their hand, but Scott Cosmo, do you have a point of view?
Yeah, in some other research, it's not this particular study. One of the real important things we needed to get at was insight. One of the things is if you've got insight, you can often make a particularly good ad. That gives you a nice launching pad for moving on to good creative. However, one of the things is, well, what's an insight? Okay, an insight has a couple of different parts. Now, certainly we kind of all know that an insight is based on fact, but it's not just a fact, it's a fact with a tension. Hopefully a tension that can be solved by the brand in some way. And it's also got to somehow or another be original with the category. So if you kind of put those three things together, you know, what you're going for in sort of some kind of consumer research is you got to lead into an insight. An insight isn't just a fact, it's got attention in there.
Yeah, Paul, I think there's another dimension as well, which I think has gotten better recently, which is for creatives. They've been less interested in the kind of metrics that traditionally research has provided. So historically, when we talk about impact, effect, things like that, you know, for a lot of the creatives, it's more about, you know, the equivalent of winning an Oscar than it is about, you know, there's a creative impulse that is there. And what's great about a lot of the new measures, I think, is a lot of the new measures are getting at measuring the emotional dynamics more directly. And so the language that takes for the creatives is actually speaking to what their interest is, as opposed to kind of like what the suit's interest is. And so in that way, I think there has been a little bit more of a response from creatives because it's speaking to their creative objectives around the ad rather than just the strategic objectives around it. Sorry, you're muted, Paul.
Thanks. For anybody who's interested, the report is up on the website. And Duane, I wanted to ask you, what do you see as the landscape for copy testing? So you do neuro and biometrics. Do you do a lot of copy testing? Is that the direction that you think that the creative agencies are going?
Yeah, we do. I think that what's happening right now is there are a lot of options available to brands, options that weren't there before. And I think that brands are still trying to get their feet wet with it. But I think that the challenge that we have is moving away from a one-size-fits-all kind of like paradigm, which has the advantage of scaling, which is a big advantage. But I think that where brands need to go is they need to go to looking at what their communication objectives are and figuring out for any given brand. And it's not going to be the same for all brands, but figure out for that brand what the best-in-class approaches are for those specific communication objectives. So if you're a brand where humor is important, what is the best way for us to measure humor? You know, facial expression analysis is probably best in class there. You know, so going through and looking at the range of your communication objectives and coming up with really good, you know, best of class benchmarks for you that are actually meaningful for what those objectives really are. And that's where I see things moving more is a dissatisfaction with just common currencies. You know, something that speaks more specifically to what their brand is really trying to do.
I think one of the key takeaways of that report was that almost everybody, creatives and researchers, was also a survey done among strategy people and researchers. Almost everybody felt that research was important up until and including the brief. And that's where, to Marc's point, where sort of differences of opinions start to occur, where creatives begin to think of research as a grading system. Also of interest is that creatives, what the research that they wanted to see was more traditional qualitative focus groups, ethnographies, to really understand who the consumer was. And when you ask the researchers, like you, they're more interested in the techniques using neuroscience and biofeedback. So it's a great report. By all means, go up. We do have a question from the audience, from Philip. It was directed at Harlan and Marc, but it really applies to everybody. And it obviously, and the reason why it's directed at Harlan and Marc is quick service restaurants right now are going through something very different from the time period that you were evaluating. Philip asked the question, how does your results from 2013, if that was the date, I think, how do they apply to the environment which exists today? And I'm thinking about Sara, same question. How do you use passion today in terms of what consumer mindset is? And I think the question will go to everybody, but why don't we start off with Harlan and Marc?
I think that's a good question. But if you look at our takeaways, one, that traditional advertising was important, and that ad quality was a really important variable as well. So it's not just a matter of advertising, but it's content in the ad is important. And then the other piece is this interesting situation with promotions. And I think what you find now in the current situation is that it's forced companies to think differently. You know, they've kind of been in this mode, which is reflected from our data, of using promotion to drive traffic, using traditional media to build branding activity. But now we're seeing that they're being forced to think of other ways in which to compete. Philip mentioned delivery, but you're also looking at other types of promotions where we were seeing some effects due to price discounting and other types of value meal type promotions. I think companies are more under pressure in terms of the bottom line. So they need to be thinking about how they maximize what they're taking away from any type of promotion. And then it's kind of if you look at some of what they're talking about now, companies are under cost pressure, so they're cutting ad budgets. But at the same time, some of what's being recommended is that companies need to remember that they have to think about brand building. And I think that's a critical piece going forward in terms of the initial responses to cut it. But going forward, they need to be thinking about how they bring brand building back into the process. Marc?
Do you think that your results reflected just creating an awareness for quick service? You said radio, so it's drive time on the way home, an invitation for stopping at a quick service restaurant. What do you think the creative would be today once quick service starts advertising again? I personally think from a media point of view, because much of what you were finding was really about media and not so much about the message. And I think from a media point of view, 2013 and now, it's going to be the same thing, just trying to reach people, you know, as before they have dinner or be on their way to a.
And the Emeritus score really, their measure really focuses on branded attention and generating motivation. So when we talked about ad quality in the content, that it's that brand linkage that really becomes important in what they're measuring. And as we move forward here, you know, as well as what we saw, was that for the market leader, it was actually, you get to a point where it goes beyond just what they're spending in media. It's the ad quality piece becomes, the brand linkage piece becomes important. Marc?
Do you think there'll be, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say, I think the first inclination of companies, you know, when there's a downturn, is to go to the dark side and do a lot of promotions. I think that the research that has been done in the past during downturns is that you've got to double down on your maintaining your advertising shares, and quality becomes important. Things like passion that Sara was talking about, emotion, possibly nostalgia, harking back to brand meanings and tied to new realities of the pandemic, feel-good foods, you know, in a fast food context, you know, the Big Mac, which has a nostalgic value, loving it, you deserve a break today, kind of, you know, those are nostalgic and might play well in terms of emotion, and it might be part of the passion, whatever the passion is of a brand, I think has to be reinforced. And I think if there's an inclination to go first with promotions, that's probably not the best long-term strategy for the brand.
Sara, do you think the advertising that you're seeing during this crisis is reflecting more passion?
Not necessarily. I'm sure it's quite different also in different markets. You know, here in Sweden, we are keeping up a little bit more as usual, I would say. But I think it's a good point, this with the quality aspect of advertising. I mean, we know always that quality has a big impact. Like, creativity is an important way to get more out of your investments. And of course, if you are under pressure and you're cutting your budgets, of course, you have to be more mindful, even more mindful about what you do in your advertising to make sure that it really pays off. And if we look at like the signaling effects that I was discussing, so there is one quantitative side of it, which is, you know, spending a lot, which signals that you have confidence. But then there is the other part, which is being smart about how you communicate, or being passionate about how you communicate, where you can convey quality, and you can build the brand in a more indirect kind of way through different signals. And I would say that, I mean, if you're under pressure, you probably want to look more in that direction to make sure that you are really getting maximum out of the investments that you're making in terms of media. So that would be one aspect that I think about right now.
Hey, Sara,
Paul,
I have a question related to the presentation that you made a few weeks ago at another ARF event. Walker Smith from Kantar made the argument that we used to see a lot of advertising that was pretty much about product feature, you know, and attributes of the product, and that part of the kind of revolution of the 1960s and 70s in individualism, you know, was conveyed very much in advertising to being more about the person using the product, and that this extended across all categories of advertising. He was making an argument for purpose-driven advertising now, where advertisers are trying to not simply make a claim about the kind of person using a product, but also what the brand itself stands for. But this passion signaling seemed very, very consistent, at least with that notion of advertising being not as much about a product feature, but about the kind of user, the kind of person that would go with that brand. Do you think that's a...
I mean, both yes and no, but I think one of the things with signaling is that it's conveying something about the brand and the people who are behind it. So as a consumer, you don't really know what kind of quality is being offered, or you don't know how unique this specific brand is necessarily. And given the way that the market looks now, we can expect that most of the brands out there have good quality, right? So when we see somebody who's doing something passionate or doing something creative, that kind of conveys to us that if they're doing this in their advertising, they're probably doing it in other parts of their organization as well, such as product development or product quality. So I have a project with another colleague where we looked at, I mean, you even think that they are treating their employees better when they have creative advertising, because this seems to be the kind of organization where you make an effort in every type of things that you do. And I think that's so interesting with advertising, because advertising is, given the way that the communication landscape look right now, with, you know, a lot of user generated content, you have reviews, you have a lot of things, but advertising is controlled by the brand. The brand decides this is what we're going to go with. So it's really a strong signal about what kind of brand it is and how they go about things. So I think that the signaling perspective is becoming even stronger in this kind of a landscape.
And just about everything that a brand does these days, particularly in an era of social media, is at some level advertising. It's not just the paid commercials.
Yeah, but I think that the things that you control become even more important, given that there's so many different messages around your brand today.
And just to add one more dimension to the discussion, the other thing, of course, which is really important and critical in terms of the variability of the effect, is the environment, is the context in which the ad ultimately appears. We just shared results from a study we did earlier last week, where we tested COVID-themed ads for brands versus their standard themed ads, you know, the standard ads for brands. But we did it in different program environments. So we did it in the news environment, and we also did it in the comedy environment. And what was interesting for us was, remember, it's the same two ads that we're testing. You know, there was the standard ad and the COVID-themed ad. And what was really fascinating was to see the general superiority of the news environment for that kind of messaging. For some brands, the damage in the comedy environment was really quite stark. So there is also something kind of not just about the creative itself, but also about the context, about the environment in which the message appears and what the nature of that fit is.
Duane, let me ask you a question about the context in your research, because it wasn't clear to me exactly how you embedded the ads in your experiments in the lab. You had a nice number of cases, but for example, were the ads being presented on a computer screen?
It's a great question.
Yeah, because the device matters a lot when it comes to
it does.
The length and duration of an ad.
That's why I love the question, because just as we can talk about program environment, you also have to talk about the viewing environment. And so we have a new product, Scott, which is called Stream Pulse, which is our own private OTT channel. So of course, this was not research that we could do in lab, because all of the cities where we have labs are in shelter in place. So, that didn't work. But we have our Stream Pulse product, which is our private OTT channel. So this was all done on TV sets in homes. And they watched a comedy of their choice. There were 4 comedies they could choose from. Or they watched the news of their choice. So we had Fox News, MSNBC, and CNN. And we updated the news every day so that it was always kind of fresh. But the ad breaks were always held constant. And then people were randomly allocated into cells where there were mixes of COVID themed or standard. And across the whole sample, we had adequate sample for both of those comparisons. So for every brand, we had data on how their standard ad performed in each of those environments and how the COVID themed ad occurred in those environments.
And what was the device context for the data that you presented, comparing 7s and 15s and 30s?
So those were done in our NeuroCube, which are cubicles. So those are, just because of the numbers that we need in those are actually cubicles with a monitor in front of you. And we create the environment as best as we can to kind of simulate that you're in a TV environment, for example. So that might include a bug and, that whole sense of, so it's still somewhat naturalistic, but of course it is in a cubicle at the end of the day.
I can add an anecdote in that we're doing research with Duane's firm on cross-platform standards. And we started very early in the year in January in laboratory. And the stimuli were basically home and cooking shows on all media, on laptops, on desktops, on television sets. And then mid-January, as all of this news started to hit, we decided, do we really want to do the testing on the news environment? Because the news environment is so negative. So we put a pause on it. Little did we know, 1 week later, New York City would have been closed down and Chicago would have been closed down. So like so much of this research, we've just paused it until people's media behavior gets back to normal. So I want to thank all of our panelists. We're out of time. Thank you so much for your creative insights. Big virtual round of applause. It must be really tough doing late night with absolutely no applause. I would have my own soundtrack and hit the button. That's a joke. Just a couple
New Zealand and Australia early morning.
Yes. Watch for the next issue of JAR. The focus there is about creativity. I'm sorry, not creativity, gender and diversity. Thank you. And just a reminder, we are recording today's broadcast, and that will be available, I think Carolyn told me, within about a week on our website. Also, we'll be sending out a survey. Please fill it out for us and help us make these sessions better. And by all means, I mentioned a few things which are up on our website. In addition to some of the reports, the creative reports I talked about, we have upcoming events, so visit the ARF website. Thanks very much for your attention, and stay safe, everyone.